My name is Kirk Dunn, and this is the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. I'm an actor, writer, and knitter, and I'm also known as the Knitting Pilgrim. I earned that title because in 2003, I was awarded an Ontario Arts Council Chalmers grant to knit stitched glass, an installation of 3 large panels designed in the style of stained glass windows, which look at the commonalities and the conflicts between the 3 Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They took me 15 years to knit. And when the project was complete, my wife Claire and I wrote a play called The Knitting Pilgrim about my experience knitting stitched glass and my research into interfaith relations. One thing that wasn't covered in the play was the meaning behind the imagery in the knitted panels. So, this series explores each section in conversation because, ultimately, the project is about having conversations with empathy and curiosity about how we understand and sometimes misunderstand each other. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. The section we're exploring today in the Knitting Pilgrim Talks is part of the Christian tapestry or panel. It deals with patriarchy or exclusion in the Christian church. And in this section, we can see a female form who's reaching up to the figure on the cross, and she's being marginalized or pushed aside. And then in the background, we can see some triangles, and the brown triangles evoke the vulva, and the pink triangles represent the LGBTQ community, which has been persecuted and ostracized by the Christian church. And to talk further about this section of the Christian window, I'm happy to welcome Reverend Daniel Brereton. Daniel is an ordained minister in the Anglican Church, and during his time as Vicar of Christ's Cathedral, Hamilton, he co-founded Integrity Niagara, a community of clergy and lay Anglicans dedicated to equal marriage and the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the Anglican Church. Reverend Daniel is happily married to his husband James and is the priest in charge at St. John's Dixie in Mississauga. Welcome, Reverend Daniel. Now, you are a out minister in a loving, committed relationship in the Anglican Church in Canada. As someone who is part of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, I can tell you that right now our church is presently struggling with exactly this issue. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience in coming out in the church and how you were welcomed and included.
That's a long story, but the short version, I went to seminary, and I was at the time I had been dating a woman. We were actually engaged, and then in the course of my first year at seminary, I came to the realization that I was having questions around my identity, and I needed to do some exploring. So we broke off that relationship. She was incredibly supportive, I have to say. I met my first boyfriend in seminary. He was a priest, and at that time, the church was not dealing with it. Like it was a topic for discussion and constant debate, but there was no sign at that time that I couldn't imagine that the church would ever get to a point where I would be able to be married and have that recognized in the church and actually be open about it. I remember getting ordained thinking the best that I could possibly hope for is to have a bishop that doesn't ask too many questions, have a congregation that doesn't ask too many questions, and I have my boyfriend on the side that everybody just pretends is a close friend, and we'll all agree not to talk about it. And that's still the reality for a lot of gay people in the church. I've always been very fortunate that anywhere I've served, when I was a student in seminary, my classmates in seminary, my instructors, and then when I was ordained, my bishop and the clergy and members of the congregation in every church I've been in have always made me feel very welcome and supported. And it's progressed. It went from people who sort of quietly let me know that they were supportive, but knew that we couldn't talk about it openly, to being very open about it. And yeah, and now the congregation I'm part of now they've been on a journey too. I mean, when I first came here, not everybody was open to that, but and some people left when I came out to the congregation, uh, and quite a number of people struggled with it, but decided they would remain, and we've kind of continued to walk together and learn from each other to the point where I think I think a lot of people have kind of changed their views because of their interaction with me and that. But it's not an easy journey to agree to disagree and keep
Yeah,
journeying
yeah.
together.
Well, that's really impressive. I mean, that speaks highly of those people and the fact that they would stick around and do that, and it also speaks pretty highly of you that you would help them with that journey and you be open to that, because that's got to be a huge risk to you, and I would think that you'd be very vulnerable in that path.
It is, and I think that there's a there's a line there too that you walk between uh, walking with people you don't completely agree with, and being willing to learn from each other, and at what point do you walk away because by staying you're just encouraging and empowering those who are homophobic. So that's a conversation my husband and I have had to have, because in the early days when things weren't so supportive, I mean, he was like, "Why do you put up with this? Why are you sticking this out?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Well, it's a pretty interesting question. And so I'd like to ask you further about that. And I am, you are the priest, you are the minister, you've got the master's in divinity, not I. I've read some Bible and I've been around it all my life, but I can't really quote too terribly specifically. And my understanding is that as far as what Jesus said, I will quote what Jesus said about homosexuality. Okay, I'm done.
exactly.
So he had nothing to say about it. And then there are a few verses. I think there's some from Leviticus, and then there are a couple from Paul's letters that mention it in strange context. I mean, the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, where angels are being saved from being raped by giving them your daughters instead, is just like a bizarre thing. But yeah, so there's all that. And I don't know what the numbers are, what the stats are, but just percentage wise of the things said in the Bible, this has got to be like homosexuality has got to be a minuscule, just like a tiny, tiny fraction of all the things that are said there. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't matter to the Bible. It just doesn't matter. So why does it matter so much to some people?
Again, good question. I think a lot of it has to do with patriarchy, with I think homophobia and transphobia are very much tied in with misogyny,
Right.
because I think anything that sort of threatens a fixed sense of gender and power and how those genders relate to one another, I think is going to be a threat to those who are invested in that framework. There's culturally, it's not a coincidence that gay rights always. Why am I doing this? It is a thing. Gay rights, but always follow on the heels of women's rights. Until women are acknowledged as equal, you can't even start talking about differences in sexual and gender identity. Right. So I think a lot of it has to do with patriarchy and this idea that, especially in a culture where women are seen as lesser than, two men together, one of them is putting themselves in the position of a woman, and what could be a worse degradation of manhood than that? Two women together are showing that they don't need a man to be happy. That's hugely threatening to the patriarchy. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. Also, if you can, I think it's a scapegoating thing. If you can find a community to pin all of your disgust and anger and sin on, then we don't have to look at our own sins. Like, you mentioned the Bible not having much to say about homosexuality. It has a great deal to say about idolatry and greed and the use of the misuse of money. But as a capitalist culture, we don't want to talk about that because that implicates all of us, right?
Yeah.
So better to have a community that I can distance myself from and say they're the representative of all that's evil.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, this is a battle that is ongoing, and as you say, it's linked to a patriarchy, and I can see what you're saying now too about capitalism, and that makes a lot of sense. And that's just a indication that it will continue in all likelihood. Thank you, Reverend Daniel. Really appreciate your being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You can reach Reverend Daniel through the website of St. John's Dixie Anglican Church, or you can follow him on Twitter via his Twitter handle @Reverend Daniel. This has been an episode of the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. We'd like to thank the Ontario Arts Council for their support of this conversation series and their funding of Stitch Glass, and the Toronto Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of the Knitting Pilgrim Show. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this about interfaith matters, stitched glass, and knitting, please check out our episodes at kirkdunn.com or the Knitting Pilgrim YouTube channel.